Hello, welcome back to our channel. Thank you for staying with us and supporting our channel over the past while. Everything I create is purely speculative and reflects my personal views. Naomi is hiding the fact that she tested positive for the BRCA gene. Jacob has accepted an extremely dangerous assignment and has been pulled into the case involving the plasma ring operation. The two of them are forced to live apart to protect Naomi, while Jacob's undercover mission grows more fragile by the day as he keeps running into situations he never anticipated. Naomi was never afraid of silence. What frightened her was deliberate silence, the kind of silence built like a cold wall between two people who had once been so close they could read each other through the rhythm of a single breath. Jacob did not disappear from their home in some sudden, obvious way. Instead, he withdrew little by little, as if he were erasing himself from her life through gestures so small they became cruel. His eyes would slide away from hers halfway through a glance. His touch never lingered the way it once had. On some nights, he sat completely still, staring at his phone as though something inside that dark screen held the power to control his fate. To Naomi, it was not just distance. It was the feeling of being systematically shut out, of being forced to play the role of an outsider inside her own marriage. She was used to pressure, used to hiding private fears. Learning that she carried the BRCA gene had hollowed out a quiet emptiness inside her, a low-burning anxiety that never truly went away. She chose to keep it secret, partly because she wanted to control her own fear, and partly because she could not bear the thought of being looked at with pity. That was why, when Jacob began to change, Naomi did not only suffer because her husband seemed distant. She also found herself cornered into blaming herself. She thought Jacob had somehow sensed the secret she was keeping. She believed his coldness was a silent judgment. She thought perhaps he was disappointed, perhaps angry, perhaps simply waiting for her to confess the truth on her own. That thought twisted Naomi's anger into something uglier. She was angry at Jacob for not asking, angry at herself for not telling him, and angry at the way their love had somehow become a battlefield without sound. Naomi being forced to hide her condition while the pressure between her and Jacob escalates is a storyline that had already been clearly hinted at in preview sources from early 2026. But the truth was worse than anything she had prepared herself for. Jacob had not grown cold because he despised her, nor had he become distant because he no longer loved her. He had pulled away because he was stepping into a place where even the simple act of missing his wife could become a fatal weakness. When Naomi first pieced together the scattered fragments, the way Jacob stared at his phone as if waiting for a signal, the unexplained absences, the extreme weariness, the awkward decision to move out, she did not feel relieved at finally understanding. She went numb because she realized she had misjudged everything, and the price of that mistake could be Jacob's life. Jacob accepting a dangerous mission, being warned about the brutality of deep cover work, and then being forced to live separately in order to keep Naomi safe for developments already described in episode previews from February 2026. At first, the plasma ring was only a vague name in Naomi's mind, a term that sounded like it belonged in an investigation file. Only when bits of information slowly surfaced did she understand that it was not an ordinary criminal network, but a money-making machine fed by human blood, by greed, and by enforced silence. It survived on the desperate, on victims easy to manipulate, on links in the chain threatened until they had no way back. What made it terrifying was not just violence, but its cold replaceability. If one person vanished, another would be dragged in. If one link broke, the system would crush that person and seal itself shut again. In an organization like that, mistakes did not have to be big. A look that lingered too long, a reaction half a beat too slow, a question asked at the wrong moment, any of it could turn a disguised infiltrator into an unclaimed corpse. The latest spoilers suggest that the plasma ring investigation is the central source of danger in Jacob's arc, and one new revelation may threaten his entire operation. Jacob knew that before Naomi ever did. He stepped into the darkness not because he did not understand the consequences, but because he understood them too well and was haunted by the need to do something before it was too late. Beneath his hard, steady calm was a kind of anger he had never truly named, anger at helplessness, at the way evil could thrive so openly beside the people he loved. There was also another motive, more private and more painful, the need to prove himself. Every time he was reminded that he was too inexperienced to go this deep, one part of him felt not just underestimated, but robbed of the chance to prove what he was capable of. The pressure of the mission merged with the pressure to become the kind of man strong enough to carry it, and that turned his courage into something dangerously close to recklessness. Some recent recaps and commentaries have also emphasized that Jacob sees this mission as a chance to prove himself, even while those closest to him can see more clearly just how much danger he is gambling with. He convinced himself that separating from Naomi was the only way to protect her. But for Naomi, it was a wound that did not bleed right away, one that quietly cracked the structure of her entire life. She no longer had the right to call him whenever panic struck. She no longer had the right to be angry in the ordinary way a wife would be. She no longer had the right to demand a full explanation because every detail could make her a target. That sacrifice carried the name of protection, but to Naomi, it felt like being stripped of power. She was forced to endure fear without being allowed any control over it. That was why her anger did not fade after learning the truth. It burned even hotter, because now she was terrified of losing Jacob and furious that he had chosen to decide the fate of both of them on his own. Every secret meeting Jacob had with people inside the operation wore him down in a different way. Danger did not always come in the form of guns. Sometimes it came in the shape of suspicious eyes, in a silence that lasted too long around a table, in the feeling that too many people were watching while no one said a word. Once, while trying to maintain his cover, Jacob caught sight of a familiar face in a place where no familiar face should ever have appeared. His first feeling was not fear, but a cold flash of rage. Everything he had worked to control suddenly slipped off course because of a coincidence he could not stop. That specific detail, encountering a familiar face while undercover, appeared in late February episode descriptions, signaling that Jacob's cover may be in danger of collapsing much sooner than expected. From that moment on, Jacob was no longer just playing the role of an infiltrator. He had to play the role of a man who had no idea he was being watched. The hardest part was not pretending in front of enemies, but fighting human instinct when his own body was sounding the alarm. He had to learn to keep his breathing steady when he felt danger tightening around him. He had to swallow his anger each time someone tested his limits. He had to stand perfectly still as though nothing was wrong when every instinct warned him that one quick turn of the head could end everything. In a place like that, bravery was not glamorous in the heroic sense. It was dirty, exhausting, lonely, and always shadowed by the probability of failure. Meanwhile, Naomi was left behind in a different kind of hell, the hell of waiting. When no one knows for certain whether disaster has already happened, the mind creates endless versions of tragedy on its own. Every time her phone vibrated, her heart no longer leapt with hope. It clenched with fear. The secret messages, brief and broken, were too short to comfort her and just long enough to prolong the agony of uncertainty. She began to hate the phone, hate its alert sounds, even hate the way she had been conditioned to live off a few clipped words. She tried to appear normal in front of the family, but inside, her anger grew heavier by the day, anger at the organization that had dragged Jacob into danger. Anger at the law because justice demanded too cruel a price, and anger at her own love because it kept her from simply turning away and letting go. Then the turning point came in the cruelest way possible. Just when Naomi's nerves had already been stretched to the breaking point, she discovered she was pregnant. In this version of the story, that is a logical expansion rather than an officially confirmed development. But because it arrives at precisely that moment, it does not feel like a simple miracle. It crashed into her life like a blow that shatters whatever fragile order she had left. Naomi was not only shocked, She was nearly frozen. Her first flicker of joy had not even had time to form before it was twisted by a harsher question than any other. Would this child be born into a real home, or into a house full of absence? Would this baby become Jacob's reason to survive and come back? Or would it become the witness to the cruelest possible moment fate could have chosen to give her one more thing to lose? From that instant on, Naomi's fear changed shape. Before, she had been afraid of losing her husband. Now, she was afraid of losing the future itself. She saw everything through the eyes of a woman who had to protect a new life while not being allowed to collapse. But what exhausted her most was the question with no answer. Should she tell Jacob or not? If she told him too soon, he might lose focus at the exact moment when even the smallest lapse could get him killed. If she waited too long, she might rob him of the greatest reason to hold on to life in his darkest hours. That choice made Naomi realize that sometimes being the one left behind is more brutal than stepping into danger. The one who leaves at least has a concrete objective. The one who stays behind has nothing but endless possibilities, and not a single one of them is painless. She began to live in a state of relentless inner conflict. One part of her wanted to scream, to force Jacob to come home immediately, to drag him out of everything and let the consequences fall where they may. The other part understood that if he pulled back halfway through, every sacrifice made so far could become meaningless, and might even trigger a more vicious retaliation. Naomi hated having to think clearly while her heart was in chaos. She hated having to accept that loving someone does not always mean keeping them close, but sometimes means enduring the fact that they are walking into a place that may swallow them whole. But that maturity did not make her anger disappear. It only made it quieter, heavier, and sharper. On Jacob's side, the mission entered a phase where every interaction could be a trap. A guard standing a little too close for a little too long. An emergency exit suddenly locked at a moment no one could explain. A glance exchanged between people who said nothing but seemed to have understood something. He sensed the walls closing in before he had any proof. What made that feeling so terrifying was not that it exploded, it was that it was silent. Like walking into a room and knowing the air inside has changed. Like hearing danger with your skin instead of your ears. One wrong reaction, and he would expose himself. During one critical encounter, Jacob was forced to make an almost impossible choice, push deeper to maintain credibility in the eyes of the organization, or slow down to protect himself and risk being seen as suspicious. That moment laid bare the tragedy at the center of his motives. If he moved forward, he might lose any path back. If he pulled away, then all the days spent apart from Naomi, all the fear she had carried, all the price both of them had paid would amount to nothing. In that instant, Jacob's courage was no longer a noble quality. It became a double-edged blade. The braver he was, the more likely he was to go so far that he could never return. At home, Naomi began to feel waves of panic rising for no reason in the quietest moments. No one told her that anything had happened, but her body reacted as if it had received a signal her mind had not yet processed. There are fears born from the instinct of someone standing on the edge of losing what matters most. She tried to call, nothing. She tried to stay calm. She could not. She tried to convince herself that silence did not always mean bad news, but the more she tried to steady herself, the more the emptiness spread through her like ice. That fear reached its peak when an unusual call left her frozen. In this expanded version, the call does not confirm that Jacob is dead, but it is enough to signal that the mission has gone beyond the boundaries of safe control. One interrupted piece of information, one inaccurate contact point, one missing report in the timeline, any of it is enough to make hope feel more fragile than ever. Naomi now stands before the cruelest choice of her life: prepare herself for the possibility of losing her husband, or keep clinging to hope until it slowly destroys her from the inside. The child growing inside her makes every emotion sharper, heavier, impossible to postpone. If Jacob is still alive, she must stay strong enough to wait. If Jacob cannot come back, she must learn to hate fate without being allowed to fall apart. The thought that her child might grow up in the shadow of an absent father before even being born leaves Naomi almost unable to breathe. But at the very bottom of that despair, her survival instinct begins to change. She is no longer only the wife left behind in fear. She becomes a future mother forced to keep thinking, keep living, and prepare herself to face the truth no matter how brutal it may be. If Jacob still has a chance to hear that he is about to become a father, it will not simply be a moment of happiness. It will strike directly at every layer of emotional armor he has built during the mission. That news could become his strongest reason to hold on to life, but it could also become his most dangerous burden. Because a man who has something to return to is always more vulnerable to mistakes under the temptation to survive. And if he never gets to hear it, then Naomi's greatest tragedy will not only be losing the man she loves, but carrying good news inside her chest until it hardens into a grief he can never fully share. The cruelest thing in this story is not a question of who is right and who is wrong. Naomi is justified in her anger for being pushed out, for being forced to live inside uncertainty and fear, for the way justice has become far too expensive for a woman who only wants her husband to come home alive and whole. Jacob is also justified in choosing to walk into the darkness, in believing that if no one dares step forward, evil will keep crushing those who are weaker. Their tragedy lies in the fact that both of them act out of love, yet that same love pushes them to opposite ends of the same suffering. One chooses to sacrifice closeness in order to protect. The other is wounded by being protected in a way she never chose. There is no lack of love between them. What is wearing them down is the cost that love demands from both of them. And that is what makes this story feel most suffocating of all. No one can be sure whether the growing distance between them is only a temporary test, or the first shape of a loss that cannot be undone. If Jacob comes back, he will have to face the truth that his courage has left fractures inside Naomi that can never be completely erased. If he does not come back, Naomi will have to learn how to keep living with anger that has nowhere left to go, with the child growing inside her, and with the memory of a man who chose to step into the dark not because he was fearless, but because he was afraid of living in a world where he had turned away from evil. At that point, the biggest question will no longer be whether Jacob survives, but if he does. Whether the two of them will still have anything left that remains unbroken after fate has pushed them this brutally to the edge.